today to host Sheikh Youssef Wahb. He's a research director at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, an Islamic law instructor at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law, and a family law and Islamic finance author for LexisNexis Canada. He holds a bachelor degree in Islamic study from Al-Azhar University, a master of law from the University of Windsor, an MA from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and is currently completing his PhD in Islamic law at the University of Chicago Middle Eastern Studies program. Jazakallah khair for joining us.
Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna 'ilma. Allahumma inna nas'aluka 'ilman nafi'a wa 'amalan salihan mutaqabbala wa rizqan halalan tayyiba. I begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, most gracious and the most merciful, and I ask Allah to send His blessings and greetings upon our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, his family and his companions and all of our righteous predecessors. Ameen. First of all, Jazakallah khairan again for the kind invite. It's been, mashallah, a lovely day spending this day here around the community. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless this masjid and bless this community, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable you all to continue to grow and to continue to serve this community and beyond. Ameen. The topic of this discussion, and I would love to have it as a discussion, inshallah, not just as a one-way talk, is to think about some general principles of how to read the Quran and how to reflect on the Quran. And I would like to start with a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said. I will read the hadith in Arabic and then we'll try to translate it, but I will need your help translate the hadith. It's very interesting. It has some important words that we should really think together about what they possibly mean. So the Prophet ﷺ said, لم يأذن الله لشيء ما أذن للنبي أن يتغنى بالقرآن. لم يأذن الله لشيء ما أذن للنبي أن يتغنى بالقرآن. So now if we take this hadith literally, it says لم يأذن الله. Any Arabic speaking person, once they hear the word ya'dhan, the first meaning that comes to mind is permission. That God has not permitted something. This is the first part of the hadith. Adhina, ya'dhan, usually that verb means to give permission. If you give somebody permission to come in, so like give idhn, or give permission for somebody to do that. So that's the first part. So if you translate it like this, you would say, God has not permitted something, because it talks in a general sense. As much as He permitted, that's the meaning. Again, I'm translating literally, but then I'm going to go back and reflect on it maybe in a different way. As much as He permitted, and I'm doing that between quotations because we need to revisit this translation, as much as He permitted a prophet, or the prophet, talking about Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, to do something about the Quran. So the word says, أَن يَتَغَنَّى بِالْقُرْآنِ, that a prophet is doing this taghanna. Taghanna, if you're familiar with that root, or any root word related to this, taghanna, ghina, something like this, the first meaning comes to mind is singing. The word ghina in Arabic means to sing, or means singing. So if you take that literally, it means that God does not permit to something as much as He permits a prophet to. The meaning wouldn't be singing, it would be reciting the Quran in a beautiful voice. So that's just like if you take the hadith in a literal sense at a face value. But if we go back again and we look at it, and we see لم يأذن الله, the verb أذن, as I mentioned, could be permit, but it also has a relationship to the word udhun. And udhun in Arabic means ears. So taking this meaning would be that one of the most beautiful things that God loves is to listen to. Lam ya'dilillah, meaning God has never been more listening to something than He listening to a prophet, the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, reciting the Quran with ghina, again, that Arabic word. The word ghina, again, the first word that comes to mind is to recite the Quran in a beautiful voice. Or it has, if you take it singing, that means some sort of a beautiful melody or a beautiful tone that makes the Quran, as we like a nice reciter or somebody with a nice voice, we like to listen to them, so that sometimes brings us closer to the Quran at a spiritual or emotional level. But the word also has another dimension of the word ghina, could also be related to the concept of something that is enough for you, something that is sufficient. So the meaning could also be that ghina of the Quran doesn't only mean to recite the Quran in a beautiful voice. That's something nice, that's something good, that is generally recommended. But here also the meaning includes an idea that you should find the Quran sufficient for you. You should find the Quran enough for you. Another version of this hadith that has similar meaning, that the Prophet ﷺ said, لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَتَغَنَّ بِالْقُرْآنِ. The one who doesn't, again, I don't want to give one word translation because it means multiple things. The one who doesn't do that ghina, using that Arabic word, with the Quran, then he's not one of us. He's not one of our community. So some people said he means that we should recite the Quran in a beautiful voice. But a lot of scholars said that's not the only meaning that he intended, because it's not just about beautiful voice. Beautiful voice is a gift from Allah. Some people have it, some people don't have it. It is not something that is usually in our control. And the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't say the one who doesn't recite the Quran in a beautiful voice is not one of us. It doesn't sound to be really something that significant if we take the meaning to be strictly about a beautiful voice, right? So they said, what are the other possible meanings of the word taghanna or ghina? One of which is to be of ghina, and ghina means to be sufficient for you, to find the Quran enough for you. And they said the more you develop a connection with the Quran, the more you find everything in the Quran. And the more you find every answer in the Quran. Of course, we don't take that in a literal sense that every single question you have is going to be explicitly answered in the Quran. But the Quran should give you enough guiding principles that guide you to answer most, if not all, of the major questions in your life. And then, of course, the seerah and the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ complete the picture for us. So the idea, again, of yataghanna or ghina, it means you should find the Quran enough for you. You should find the Quran sufficient for your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the most eminent question becomes, what's the best way of doing this? What's the right way of approaching the book of Allah or the Quran? The thing about this question is that there is no one right answer. There isn't one recipe that fits everybody or that is suitable for everybody, that this is the only way of connecting with the Quran or of connecting with Allah through the Quran. It really takes a lot of different approaches, and that's actually one of the beauties of the Quran, is that we have different mindsets, we have different inclinations, we have different points of interest, right? That's why we have a full discipline or field of study in our tradition that is called ulum al-Quran, literally Quranic sciences. And it's called sciences because there are a lot of sciences. There's not only one science. And it's actually a lot of sciences that the scholars debated how many are they, and they couldn't come up with one answer. So that field started early on in our tradition, and then the scholars kept developing it. And then earlier, they said, okay, can we count them? Can we come up with a number of how many sciences or disciplines are they in the Quran? Some of them said it's very difficult to come up with an answer, because it depends on how you look at it. It depends on the approach to the text. Somebody like Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, for example, he said that every word in the Quran, and now think of how many words in the Quran. We have a lot of words in the Quran. Every word, not a verse, word. Every word in the Quran has 4 dimensions of a meaning. So that the meaning of every word is 4-dimensional. And he gave like a detailed kind of account for this, about a word has a literal meaning, and then has an inward meaning, and then has a background. So if you look at even the word level, that much atomistic approach to the Quran, you'll find like that multiple different dimensions. And that's why we continue to derive meanings from the Quran until today. And one of the most beautiful descriptions of the Quran is that لا يخلق على كثرة الرد. The more you recite it, you don't get bored. You actually find new meanings. And this is something unique that you don't find with any other text. Any other text, when you read it 5, 6, 10, 20 times, sometimes you love the text that much that you will read it many times, but it will eventually come to a point that, okay, I'm not really getting something new out of this. Maybe I love it, maybe I love the author, maybe I love the idea, maybe I love the theme, but eventually you will really get bored, or get, if not bored, at least enough. You feel like I don't have something new to get out of this book. The Quran is the exact opposite. The more you read the Quran, the more you find a lot of new meanings. And just to give an example, the short chapters in the Quran. These what we call qisar al-surah, the short towards the end of the Mus'haf. These like almost all of us have a lot of them memorized. This is what we recite usually in our prayers. We recite them on a daily basis. But the more we try to reflect on them, or to maybe ask somebody or read tafsir works or read history of the Quran, we always find the new meanings, right? And you always find these kind of multi-layered meanings in each verse. And the scholars, we have massive tradition of tafsir. Everyone authors a book of tafsir, adds a new layer, adds a new perspective, adds a new sometimes approach to how to understand the verse, and then the subsequent author will add more, and they'll add more, and they'll add more until today. And it's a science that never ceases to develop. It's science that is going to continue to develop until the end of time. When you look at the last two chapters of the Quran, for example, what is the last surah in the Mus'haf? Surah An-Nas, right? And then what is the surah that is before it? Surah Al-Falaq, right? What's the first word that each surah begins with? Qul. And Qul means what? Say. It's a command, it's an imperative from the word qala. Qala means to say. That's the verb in Arabic. And then when I say Qul, that means I'm asking you or I'm commanding you, say. So say, you put a quotation mark and then say this, right? This is the literal meaning. Allah is asking the Prophet, say, and then you imagine if you want to transcribe it in kind of modern script, you would put like quotation, say that statement. And then we know from these two surah, these are the mu'awwidat. These are the chapters, the two chapters that we often read for ruqya. We read to ask Allah protection against different types of evil. And we use them for ruqya against many different things. When you think of them, ruqya in a general sense, it's a dua. You're asking Allah to protect you from something, right? What does Surah An-Nas ask Allah to protect us from? The overall idea, what are we asking protection against? Evil of what? Evil of shaitan, right? قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ إِلَهِ النَّاسِ مِنْ شَرِّ الْوَسْوَاسِ الْخَنَّاسِ. We're asking Allah for protection against al-waswas al-khannas. Waswas means the whisperer, right? And actually linguistically has a concept of emphatic form, which means like a mubalagha, like is persistent whisperer. It's not like a one-time thing. They always whisper. He's always trying to whisper to us. And then khannas means that he retreats very fast. Shaitan has this trick of like giving you an idea and then runs away and then comes back and then runs away. It's not like, it's persistent in whispering to you, but not continuously. He comes and goes, he comes and goes, he comes and goes. Because like, he doesn't want you to realize that you've been whispered to. Right? If he's persistent at one point of time and just like keep asking you all day long, it's like you'll know, okay, that's shaitan, a'udhu billahi min shaitan, and you try to just like avoid him. No, the idea of khannas, it's a very kind of interesting description that like it's the very, like maybe a literal meaning is like a very fast retreating whisperer, meaning that it comes and goes very fast. So this is what we're asking Allah for protection against in Surah An-Nas. The way dua works is you are invoking some qualities of Allah against the evil of something, right? So the way we ask Allah for this dua in Surah An-Nas, we say, قُلْ أَعُوذُ, I seek refuge, say, I seek refuge, بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ, in the Lord of mankind. Okay, what does the following verse say? It's a quick Quran quiz for Surah An-Nas. I'm assuming everybody has it memorized. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ. Let's pause here. So I seek refuge in the Lord of mankind. The following verse doesn't say against what yet, right? It just describes Allah with a new quality. So the first one is رَبِّ النَّاسِ, the Lord of mankind. Then the second one, مَلِكِ النَّاسِ. Literally you can say the king or the sovereign of mankind. Okay, and then what? Against what? No, not yet. إِلَهِ النَّاسِ, third ayah, right? The Lord or the God of mankind. So رَبِّ النَّاسِ, مَلِكِ النَّاسِ, إِلَهِ النَّاسِ. Up until here, 3 verses, we still don't know what are we asking Allah for, right? We haven't said against what? You said أعوذ. أعوذ is I seek refuge. Against what? The surah doesn't say it for 3 verses. It just starts with 3 verses that says He's the Lord of mankind, He's the sovereign of mankind, He's the God of mankind. And in the 4th ayah, it mentions what are we asking protection against? مِنْ شَرِّ الْوَسْوَاسِ الْخَنَّاسِ, from the evil of the whisperer and the khannas, as I explained it. Then الَّذِي يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورِ النَّاسِ, the one that whispers in the hearts of people, مِنَ الْجِنَّةِ وَالنَّاسِ, whether that whisper from jinn or from people. Sometimes we all can relate to shaitans from people, not just from jinn. So this is what the surah is asking from Allah. Invoking qualities of Allah against the evil of the shaitan. I want you to keep that blueprint in mind because we need to compare it with the previous surah. Let's move to Surah Al-Falaq. Surah Al-Falaq says, same thing, قُل, say, أعوذ, same thing, right? بربي الفلق. That's now a new quality of Allah. I seek refuge in the Lord. Falaq literally means the day break, the beginning of the day. I seek refuge in the Lord of the day break. And then, if you base it on the same structure of Surah An-Nas, you'll expect another quality of Allah. This didn't happen here. The second verse right away mentions, what are you asking Allah for? So that's number one difference, right? There we said, Rabbin Nas, Malikin Nas, Ilahin Nas, 3 verses. Here, no. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ مِنْ شَرِّ مَا خَلَقَ. Right? I seek refuge in the Lord of the daybreak from the evil of his creatures, or of his, like the evil from amongst his creatures. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ مِنْ شَرِّ مَا خَلَقَ. It's very general, from any evil that he created. And then, وَمِنْ شَرِّ غَاسِقٍ إِذَا وَقَبْ. What is غَاسِقٍ إِذَا وَقَبْ? The general meaning? The darkness. Darkness is understood to mean as a source of bad thing that might happen to you. That's just like how the human beings, how the human mind is wired generally, or at least traditionally, is that darkness is a source of evil somehow. And إِذَا وَقَبْ means when it covers fully, like a complete darkness. So I seek refuge against the evil of creatures and also from the evil of darkness. That's just very simplistic translation. من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد. And from those who blow in the nuts, meaning it's the people of magic, people who make magic to harm others. ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد. And against the envy of those who envy others. So what is happening here? We're asking Allah protection against multiple things, right? Not only one thing. So have evil in the creation in general, and then from darkness, and then from magic, and then from envy. 4 things. In Surah An-Nas, we ask for how many things? I know it's getting late, but is it that late? So again, Surah An-Nas, we're asking against the evil of one main thing, which is shaitan. We agreed on that already, right? In Surah Al-Falaq, we're asking for protection against multiple things. Again, evil in general, darkness, magic, envy. So now to think of it to compare the number of qualities of Allah in one surah and the number you're asking protection against in the other surah. In Surah An-Nas, even though we're asking for one thing, we mentioned at the beginning, the Quran mentioned at the beginning 3 different qualities of Allah. But when it comes to Surah Al-Falaq, we're asking protection against 4 things. So 4 against 1. 4 in Al-Falaq, 1 in An-Nas. 4 things we're asking Allah for protection against in Surah Al-Falaq. We only invoked 1 quality of Allah. So basically, to put it in a simple manner, Surah Al-Falaq, 1 quality against 4 different types of evil. In Surah An-Nas, 3 qualities against 1 type of evil. Sounds disproportionate, right? Because like you would imagine, okay, if I'm asking for more things from Allah, I would need to invoke more qualities and attributes of Allah. No, Surah Al-Falaq didn't do that. Rabb al-Falaq, that's it. One description, 1 quality. The Lord of the daybreak, that's it. And then a list of 4 things. Surah An-Nas, 3 qualities of Allah, Rabbin Nas, Malikin Nas, Ilahin Nas, and then we're asking only for protection against 1 thing. So when you make that comparison, that should make us think, it looks like what's in Surah An-Nas is more significant, right? Because what's in Surah Al-Falaq, these 4 types of evil, the consequences of these 4 types of evil most likely are materialistic things, right? Evil, envy, magic, darkness, the harm that might come to you from these things most likely are tangible, are materialistic, are like physical things. They're not necessarily, that's the whole point, they're not necessarily tied to your religion, to your relationship with Allah. But in Surah An-Nas, if the shaitan gets to you, it ruins your relationship with Allah. So as if the 2 surahs are giving us that sense that your spiritual well-being is far more important than your physical well-being. Not that you have to choose. So you generally ask Allah for protection against every evil, physical or otherwise. But the idea in general is that to fight against the shaitan, that's huge. You need a lot of support for that. You need Allah, you need to invoke a lot of qualities of Allah, and you need to really feel, and that's the point of dua. The reason in dua we start with praising Allah is to, I don't want to use like common words like get in the mood, that's not the most appropriate word, but really to get yourself into a particular spiritual state to be able to really connect with Allah when you're making dua, right? And if you ask Him for something big, like asking Allah to overcome the shaitan, which is the constant struggle that is going to stay with us until we die. We're not going to get rid of that. You can't get rid entirely of the shaitan. It's going to be there all the time. That's why you always need the constant support of Allah by invoking Allah and asking Allah in many different ways and by invoking different qualities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why in Surah Al-Nas required that number of qualities. But in Surah Al-Falaq, when you ask Allah to protect you from the general kind of harms in this life, which are again most likely physical or tangible, one quality, the surah at least, this is, of course these are reflections, not necessarily the definitive meaning that Allah intended. So this is something when we talk about tafsir or tadabbur, these are like the scholarly reflections on these ayat. So that it sounds to be that Allah is teaching us that your spiritual well-being is very more important than your physical well-being. And again, both are important, but this is how you connect with Allah through making dua in this way. So that is one example of, okay, now I can always go back to ayat that I often recite, that I have memorized, that I recite every day in salah, or I say in adhkar, or I say in ruqya, like these two chapters. And I feel like there are actually more meanings and more reflections that I can come up with. I can come up with personally, and I will talk about this maybe towards the end, or I can ask somebody or attend a class or read a tafsir. There are a lot of different ways of actually acquiring more and more knowledge, and it's like, as they say, a sea without shore. Like you can't, there's no kind of a particular time you say you graduated from studying the Quran. It's something that you just keep doing for the rest of your life, because I mentioned the qaida is لا يخلق على كثرة الرد. The more you recite it, it never gets worn out. It never gets old. You're going to always find new meanings in the Quran. Now, how to identify my approach to the Quran? When I was mentioning the Quranic sciences, Imam al-Ghazali mentioned the multidimensional nature of the Quranic words. They said, okay, let's try to just list some of these disciplines. So they kept saying, okay, there is that discipline that looks at words, there's that discipline that looks at grammar, there's that discipline that looks at law, so they kept counting a lot of disciplines and sub-disciplines and subtopics and a lot of themes, and it kept getting like bigger and bigger. The list kept getting larger and larger, until some scholars said, okay, let's try just to designate some general categories. So let's think of one category to be historical context. That's one way. And that is important for us to identify what is our main point of interest to approach the Quran. And it's not exclusive to be one of these. You can do multiple of them. But just if you're feeling a little bit confused, or not necessarily confused, but if you're feeling you're undetermined about how can I improve my relationship with the Quran, try to find what interests you the most. Some people like to know about the history of the Quran. Some people like the phonetics, the tajweed, the articulation, the qira'at, like these, even at that level, even though you might say, but that doesn't have a lot of kind of impact on the meaning. It does have in the meaning, and more importantly, it does have in your spiritual connection. It's about you finding what interests you that brings you closer to the Quran. Some people like language. They like to see, okay, I want to find the root word and the definition of this word in a dictionary, or I like rhetoric, so I want to know the rhetorical or some rhetorical styles of the Quran. Some people like law. You want to know, like, I want to read or understand how the Quran speaks about law. Because one of the most unique things about the Quran, it is not a book that conforms to any of these sciences. You can't call the Quran a law book. It's not a law textbook. You can't call the Quran a grammar book. You can't call the Quran a rhetoric book. You can't call the Quran a history book. You can't call the Quran a philosophy book. Like, all these disciplines contribute to understanding the Quran, but the Quran is none of these disciplines, right? It gives you glimpses, but it doesn't identify as any of these disciplines. That's something very important about the Quran. The Quran even resisted the idea of a book itself. Not just a science book or a philosophy book, no, the idea of being a book. The Quran called itself a book, even though it wasn't given to the Prophet as a book, if that makes sense. That actually confused people, or it was a point of wonder for the Arabs. And they asked the Prophet multiple times. The pagans, the polytheists in Mecca, the Jews, the Christians, they all asked the Prophet, what is that book? You keep saying book, and the Quran keeps saying ذَلِكَ الْكِتَاب, this is the book, or whatever other, Quran used the word kitab many times, right? Meaning a book. But what is this book? We didn't see a book. It literally contradicts their definition of what a book is. A book is a kind of a bounded like number of pages or sheets bounded together, have maybe one theme, or it doesn't have to be one theme, multiple themes. You know, like when you open any book, there's introduction, there's content, there's a conclusion. There's some kind of sequence, coherent themes, and kind of narrative that runs through the whole thing. Quran wasn't like that. Quran like gives the Prophet a few ayat, and then pauses, and then gives him another few ayat from a different surah. Because you know, the order we have today is not the same order he received the Quran, right? He received it in a different order, alayhi salatu wassalam. And then towards the end of his life, it was rearranged through divine wisdom. It wasn't something that he did on his own, alayhi salatu wassalam. It was Jibreel and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him towards the end of his life, this is how the arrangement of the Mus'haf should be, right? But originally throughout how many years, about 23 years, he's getting like pieces and pieces and pieces from different surah. Like I was talking in the khutbah about Surah Al-Alaq, he got 5 verses, and then there was quite a bit of a pause until the end of the surah was revealed. The remaining of Surah Al-Alaq comes after more than 30 other chapters were revealed. But then they were pieced together in the surah. So you see, it's a different sequence. So imagine yourself part of the audience early on, and he's telling you, this is the kitab. Okay, where's the book? There's no book. There's this chapter, or this piece, or this number of verses. So that was a major point of wonder that kept asking about لولا نزل عليه القرآن جملة واحدة. These said, as Allah mentioned in Surah Al-Furqan, why doesn't he receive this book all at once? People who didn't want to believe. So like, why doesn't he receive an entire book at once? Why piecemeal? Why in different portions? And Allah responds to that. It was a big question, and Allah responds on behalf of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. كذلك لنثبت به فؤادك ورتلناه ترتيلا. He mentioned 2 things. He said, 1, we want to reassure your heart. What does that mean? We want this book to be a dynamic text. People ask questions, people fall in situations, people debate things. We need the Quran to be always there to answer their questions. That's 1. وَرَتَّلْنَاهُ تَرْتِيلًا. We need to give you time to internalize it. We need to give people time to internalize it. Because the Prophet's mission was, he needs to convey everything he hears from the Jibreel to the companions and to Muslims. Right? That was his responsibility. He's not allowed to miss one word or letter from the Quran. You know what the Prophet ﷺ used to do when he first was receiving the Quran? And that's something that his cousin, Abdullah ibn Abbas, narrated. He said, initially, when Jibreel comes and gives him the Quran, and I want you to visualize this. Jibreel is reciting to the Prophet, ﷺ, the new piece of revelation. And then the Prophet is, before Jibreel finishes, he's moving his lips and tongue, trying to recite after him even before he finishes. Imagine your Quran teacher, he's reading to you and he wants you to recite after them. And then before they finish the ayah, you're just trying to hasten to just like recite very fast. Why? Because he was very worried to miss anything. He was very concerned that this is my responsibility. Allah has entrusted me with this. I have to make sure whatever I receive, I'm going to deliver to people in verbatim. So Allah revealed him an ayah in Surah Al-Qiyamah, do not do this. He told him, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به. He literally told him, do not move your tongue to rush or hasten with the revelation of this book of the Quran. لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به. And then he assured him, he said, إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه. It's upon us. It's not upon you. It's upon us to collect and recite this Mus'haf, or this Quran. And by the way, use the word Quran about the Quran, which is like the same exact word, because one of the meanings of Quran is qira'ah, is recitation. So Allah is telling him both the collection and the recitation of the text is upon us, meaning it will be collected in your heart, so you're not going to forget it. And you will be taught how to recite it very properly and very accurately. فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَهُ. Once we recite it, meaning through Jibreel, once Jibreel recites it, just follow his recitation. Do not rush. Relax, like don't really worry about forgetting anything or missing anything. And Abdullah ibn Abbas said, once he received these verses from Surah Al-Qiyamah, he stopped doing this, because now he got the divine assurance, right? It's not going to forget anything, going to wait. Jibreel gives him the message, he recites after him, and that's why Allah told him, سَنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى. We will have you recite and you will not forget. It's something that we have guaranteed you, right? But you need to receive that over time. In Surah Al-Isra, Allah says, وَقُرْآنًا فَرَقْنَاهُ. This is a Quran that we have separated. فرقنا, one of the meanings is we made it separate over times. لتقرأه على الناس على مكث. So that you can recite it to people easily and basically slowly. Like you take your time reciting this to people. Because it is not just a message that you take and go. It is something that requires engagement. And that's why it's a lifelong process. There is no like one kind of magical recipe that, okay, this is the way you read the Quran, this is one tafsir that has everything about the Quran. There's no even like the greatest tafsirs that we have in our tradition. You can't just like rely on one of them exclusively. There are great works of tafsir, of course, but you can't say, okay, this is one, I don't need anybody else. You can't do that. No one does that. Sometimes you read 20 tafsirs, 20 literally, about one verse and say like, I'm not satisfied. I need to find more. I need to find another perspective. I need to connect with the verse in a different way. And that's why, as I mentioned, that we continue to do that. And it's actually a duty for the ummah to continue connecting with the Quran in this way. So finding your point of interest, again, through history, through recitation, through a lot of different perspectives, to engage with the Quran, one of the most effective ways is to think of the first time it was revealed, and to also think of the audience that the Quran was given to. So part of the historical context is what we call Meccan Quran and Madani Quran, right? There is Meccan Quran and there is Medina Quran. How can we differentiate between like the Meccan Quran and the Medina Quran? How can we tell this surah was Meccan or Medina? Yeah. The time it was revealed. So which one is Meccan, which one is Medina? Earlier one will be Meccan, later ones will be Medina. Is there any other way we can determine what is Meccan and what is Medina? Yes. Medina is more legislation and Meccan? More about the Ummah. Okay. Any other ways of knowing? Which ones are shorter? Mecca, shorter and smaller. Okay. Sorry. And Medina are longer. Okay. Mecca is more on Iman. And then I think similar to this point, Medina was maybe more legal matters. Okay. And what? Worldly matters. Okay. Any other ways of deciding on Meccan versus Medina Quran? So you mentioned one way of looking at it is timeline. One way of looking at it is what the last few answers were thematic. Based on the topic itself, you can kind of guess, right? Is there any other way? Style. The style of language, the style of talking to the audience, for example. That's a good point, and I will share an example. Any other thoughts? Can we look at it geographically? Like the place itself, the city itself? Because now, again, we have timeline, and by the way, these are all different approaches scholars entertained. So some of them said it's timeline, meaning we put the hijrah, the immigration, as the criteria. Whatever was before is Mecca, whatever after is Medina. That's one way. It's not the only way, but that's one way. And then others said it's geographical, meaning what was in Mecca is Mecca. That's like kind of obvious from from the word, and whatever was in Medina is Medina. But he faced a problem. That opinion faced a problem. Can you guess it? If you go geographically, there will be an issue. He received the revelation outside both cities, right? So that doesn't invalidate the categorization. You can say, okay, we need to add a third category. That was neither Mecca or Medina, right? Because he received in Taif, when he went to Taif, before Hijrah, and then the story when people assaulted him, alayhi salatu wasalam. When he went to the Isra and Mi'raj, the journey to the heavens, he received Quran there. When he used to travel, even after he moved to Medina for battles or other travels, he used to receive Quran. All of these were not Meccan, literally, as a city, nor Medina. So the opinion of the approach of the geographical approach, they said, okay, and there's a third category that is not Mecca or Medina. So timeline, geography, and what a lot of you mentioned, themes. We can just look at the theme, and basically, I don't want to say guess, but like you can tell that the style, the topic, the theme is different. Why? Because the audience are different, right? And that's one approach that balagha, rhetoric, cares about a lot. The whole science of rhetoric is about how to situate your audience, right? I'm coming here, you didn't know me, I didn't know you. I'm going now to share some information with you. You didn't have a lot of background information about me. I also don't have a lot of background information about you. So whatever I say, you can say, fine. It's not like you didn't have really strong reason to think I'm lying. And you didn't also have a strong reason to think I'm saying something that is true, right? If I'm telling you right now, let's say we don't have this kind of transparent glass, and I tell you it's raining outside. And you barely know me, right? I say, it's raining outside. It's like, sure. You could be right, you could be wrong. You don't really have a strong opinion about whether what I said was right or wrong. That's one category of audience that rhetoric identifies and says, if your audience is like that, then this is how you kind of customize your speech to them. But sometimes, like, you have really bad impression about me. I hope you don't, but let's say you do, right? Like you have, like, you're not comfortable. So if I'm telling you some things, like, I'm not sure if I should take you seriously. So that's an audience that now I need to be more emphatic or add more emphasis, and I tell you, wallahi, it's raining outside. I have to do something to really try to convince you that it's raining outside. Or a third category could be like, you really didn't believe me at all because like we've had history together and like we have a very bad relationship, and I say, okay, whatever you say, I just don't believe you. So now maybe I need 2, 3, 4 layers of emphasis to probably try to convince you. The Meccan audience was basically the second and third category. They're not people who are willing to believe the Prophet ﷺ. Not just believe in him, they're not even willing to listen. And that's the point about shorter surah. Imagine Meccan audience. We know Surah Al-Baqarah is Medina, right? Surah Al-Baqarah has long verses. Surah Al-Baqarah has the longest verse in the Quran, right? The surah talks about the laws of debt or documenting debts. Do you think a Meccan audience will wait to listen to a whole verse that runs a full page? Very unlikely, right? They don't have not just the capacity, they don't have any willingness to listen. They need short, direct, and with more rhetorical kind of stylistic points that attract them. Think of Surah Al-Najm. It's a famous example. Surah Al-Najm, beautiful Meccan surah. Most of the verses are rhyming. The Quran uses the rhyming style sometimes because rhyming would really attract the audience. Very short. Starts with a qasam, with an oath, that Allah is taking an oath. And the topic of oaths is very interesting about Quran as well. Allah starts with an oath describing the stars, when najmi idha hawa. So imagine an Arab audience who appreciates language so much, doesn't believe in the Prophet, but appreciates language so much. And then the Prophet is telling them, by the star when it falls down. There's just one verse. Like, okay, that's something very interesting. That's something like, okay, why is he taking the oath that is very serious? It looks like he's going to talk about something very serious. So the following verse tells them, مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى. Your companion, meaning the Prophet ﷺ, has not gone astray. وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. He's not just making stuff up. He's not just like saying things out of his own. See how short the verses are and how rhyming they are. That has a very strong, profound impact. And the surah talks about Jibreel, talks about the revelation, talks about Isra and Mi'raj, talks about human kind of tendency towards different kinds of sinning, talks about previous nations. It's not a very long surah, but talks about a lot of themes and topics in a relatively short kind of, it's a couple pages, a little bit more. And then at the end, it talks about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who creates, the one who causes people to die, the one who makes you laugh, the one who makes you weep, the one who feeds you, the one who punishes you. A lot of descriptions, very short, very direct statements, very profound. And then the surah concludes, فَاسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ وَاعْبُدُوا. So prostrate to Allah and worship Him. Everybody around the Kaaba, when they heard the surah, non-Muslims included, they made sujood. They couldn't just hold it, they couldn't just resist. A lot of them were not Muslims, not just not Muslims. A lot of them were actually enemies of the Prophet. They made sujood. Imagine them being hit with this very strong piece of revelation, and they've been hit linguistically and rhetorically, and then all of a sudden it tells them prostrate. So they did. And then they raised their heads like, what's going on? Why did we do this? And they started asking each other what happened, and then they actually felt very embarrassed because like now we're believing in him. So they had to make up a story. And some of them said, oh, he used magic on us. And some of them said, oh, it looks like we thought he's praising our idols. So we joined him in prostrating to our idol. They had to justify because they just couldn't resist the urge to prostrate to how profound and beautiful the speech of Surah Al-Najm was. And that's only one example. There are actually multiple similar examples of people being very hit by the Makki Quran because again, it talks to the audience and understands the psychology of the audience and addresses them in a very particular manner. So the length of the verses was one style. The rhetorical tools were also used, like rhyming, for example, or Surah An-Naba amma yatasa'alun. What are they asking you about? عن النبأ العظيم. They're asking about the great major news, meaning the day of judgment. الذي هم فيه مختلفون, the one that they keep debating and arguing about. Very short verses, very attractive meanings, very attractive meanings. It is not a time to talk to people about laws. When you move to Medina, people are relaxed, right? You can talk to Muslims, and now you have a lot of followers, and talk to Muslims about laws of inheritance. You can talk about laws of documenting debts. You can talk about details of divorce and marriage and proposing in marriage, all these things. Why? People establish their belief in God, and now they're relaxed, they're literally relaxed, and they can listen to long verses, they can reflect, they can ask questions, and the Prophet clarifies, or the Quran clarifies. Now we have the very suitable environment for people to connect with the Quran at that level. In Mecca, people weren't like that. So the thematic distinction between Mecca and Madani is something that the scholars use to identify that. You find a lot about the Day of Judgment in Mecca Quran, because that was their biggest problem. People didn't really have a major issue with God. They had a major issue with resurrection. That's why you find it almost in every surah in the Quran, right? People didn't deny the idea of God. It wasn't really a kind of a major issue for a lot of people. The idea, they didn't believe in God the way Islam depicts God to be, but the idea was okay for a lot of people, right? The idea of atheism as we understand it today wasn't most common, but people had a problem with prophecy, meaning the idea that a person can just tell us what God wants us to do, and had a problem with resurrection. The Quran multiple times says, after we die and become dust and bones, are we going to be resurrected back to life? And the Quran keeps telling them, you're just committing a fallacy, because which is more difficult for God? To create you from nothing, or to bring you back to life? If you just think of God, and of course you shouldn't think of God in an ordinary manner, but let's say like using the logic, conceding your way of thinking about things, you should really contest the idea of coming from nothing. And they didn't. That was weird, because like they didn't say like, oh yeah, they all said like we're created. We didn't bring ourselves into existence. Somebody brought us into existence. So we concede the idea of God. But we can't really get it that we will be resurrected. It's a lot easier to be resurrected back to life. The Quran multiple times mentions that, right? The second kind of creation, which means it's a resurrection, it's not creation from nothing, is a lot easier. Of course, everything is easy for Allah, but just for the logic, Quran keeps reminding them that you're really committing this kind of fallacy and mistake, but they couldn't process the idea of resurrection. And it's something that humans continue to grapple with until today. Death is difficult for people to process. And what happens after death is very difficult for people to process. That's why in Surah Al-Baqarah, one of the first things that Allah praises believers is الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, those who believe in the unseen. Because there is no really many other rational ways of conceiving that. When we talk about death, what happens after death, what happens in the grave, what happens in the Day of Judgment, the accountability and the balance and the mizan and the bridge and all of these things that will happen in the Day of Judgment, as we know from the Sunnah, if you don't have a solid theological belief in the source, you can't just like independently know that these things will happen, or you can't maybe sometimes conceive of these things. But the Quran uses imagery to make it easier for us. And that's another beautiful thing about the discourse of the Quran, is that it doesn't just speak in an abstract language. It gives you very tangible images. When it talks about paradise, we'll tell you about trees, about fruits, about food, about companions, about all of that, because this is what people relate to. And we use this language that is relevant at least to the audience, right? If it talks about the hellfire, we'll do the same thing. We'll use language and imageries that people can relate to, even if it's kind of imaginative. It's not something that they can see in real life, but they can imagine. They can build the idea of metaphor. Of course, the Quran used that. Of language that people were very familiar with, like the Arabs were very familiar with these words. They basically never said, oh, we never heard this word before, or we never heard of this poetic image before. The Arabs never had that reaction. Arabs, including those who fought against the Prophet ﷺ. And that was part of the challenge of the Quran to them, that why do we know that the challenge Muslims or the Prophet ﷺ won that challenge that established the miracle of the Quran? People say, how could we tell? There is a simple argument for this, or one of the arguments, not the only argument, is that why did they choose to fight if they were able to just produce another Quran, right? That's their craft. That's their bread and butter. These people are great poets, are great writers, are great writers. Like they're just like the ability of the Arabs to use language was unbelievable. So the Quran told them, bring something like this, like the Quran. They didn't. Okay, fine. Bring 10 chapters. They didn't. Okay, bring 1 chapter. They didn't. All of that mentioned in the Quran. Then bring 1 chapter similar to the shortest chapter, like 3-4 verses. They didn't. But they choose to fight. They choose to shed blood. They went in the battle of Badr, and they literally families killing each other. If it was easy for them to produce something like it, why did they have to go through all that trouble? Let's just produce a surah, and then that's it. And we see people, okay, we won the challenge. We brought something that is equivalent. It didn't say better than the Quran, just like it, right? Just something of the same exact quality like the Quran. They didn't do that. They chose to just continue to fight against the Prophet ﷺ, and all of these lives were lost just because they didn't choose to meet the challenge of the Quran. Actually, history tells us that they didn't even try. That's the more interesting fact. The fact that they couldn't is maybe not too impressive, actually, because if you read the Quran, you really feel it's unparalleled. But the idea that they didn't even try is maybe more interesting. Because they didn't try and fail. The idea of challenge, the Quranic challenge, the tahaddi, when you say tahaddi or challenge, you feel like, okay, there was like a meeting and then they brought people from both sides and they sat down and there was a kind of a judge or a group of judges. It's not that typical image. It's just like, it's an open invitation. And towards the end, by the way, the tahaddi, the challenge started to be one-on-one. So the Quran told them, bring somebody, like a person, who can do what the Prophet did, which is, he brought the Quran, bring somebody. And then towards the end it said, do it as collective work. It's not one-to-one. Bring everybody. Actually, towards the end, the Quran told them, if you want to use jinn, go ahead. Right? It's not just human beings. Now you can literally call on everyone. قُلْ لَإِنِ اجْتَمَعَتِ الْإِنسُ وَالْجِنُّ. If you bring all of mankind, and all jinn with them too, maybe you have access to jinn, to help you draft or craft something like the Quran, you wouldn't be able to. But try if you want. They didn't even try. Because it was clear to them from the beginning that this is not just normal human speech. The Quran remained different from day one, as I mentioned. Even at the level of the description of it to be a Quran, the word Quran, they knew it, but they never used it to describe a text. They knew the word kitab, but that was a different kitab. It's not the same conventional meaning of kitab. Even the parts of the Quran were given different designations. So the Arabs would call a collection of poems a diwan. The Quran didn't call itself diwan, it called it Quran. And then every poem, they call it poem, we call it qasida. Quran used the word surah. They know the word, surah is not a foreign word, they know it, but they never use it to describe a composition of speech. Quran wanted to be unique even at the level of names. The word ayah, they didn't say bayt, verse. Like when we translate verse, verse could be a poetic verse or Quranic verse, right? So for them, verse is a poetic verse. Quran used ayah, not verse. Not the one for poetry is called bayt. Quran used different word. Even at that very minute level of the parts of the Quran gave different designations, different names to remain unique throughout the entire parts of the Quran. So that the understanding Makki and Madani Quran, the discipline of asbab al-nuzul, the causes of revelation, we have a lot of books that would tell you that situation happened, people asked questions, the Quran was revealed to answer this question. Or the companions came to the Prophet and asked about something and complained about something, and then the Quran responded to them. Sometimes you find more than one story mentioned about one ayah or one surah, and they're not contradictory. Like people, there's a story about why Surah Al-Ikhlas, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. So that's the third surah, if you remember, Nas, Al-Falaq, and Al-Ikhlas. Say, that's the third one in the Quran, moving backward from the end of the Mus'haf. Say Allah is one, right? قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. So they said a group of people, and then we have different reports about who are these people. They came to the Prophet and he said, who is your Lord? Can you describe him for us? And some of them said that the Arabs cared much about genealogy. So like everything has to do like, who are your ancestors? So like, what is the genealogy of your God? Do we have a report that a group of Meccans came and asked this question? Another report that says a group of Christians asked a similar question. And a third report says a group of Jews came and asked the same question in different kind of wording. They all asked the same question. All reports are kind of like they're authentic. And sometimes maybe more than one scenario, more than one situation will happen that will prompt the revelation of a piece in the Quran. So Allah responded to them, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. And the surah establishes the uniqueness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be not similar to anything else that people are familiar with. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is far beyond what we can perceive as human beings. The idea of different approaches to the Quran, again, through style, through language, through history, through law, through tajweed, through qira'at, all these different, what we call Quranic sciences, are really beautiful entry points for us to approach the Quran. Again, even if somebody likes the idea of tajweed or articulation, it could be their connection to the Quran. It could be their understanding or their appreciation that one day the Prophet ﷺ, after he moved to Medina and he find a lot of new Muslims are joining now, a lot of people are embracing Islam from different cultural backgrounds and very diverse when it comes to their dialects. The Arabs were not one dialect, right? Some of them were not able to recognize some words in the Quran. Some of them were not able to easily articulate words in the Quran, right? By the way, even famous companions, they didn't know certain words in the Quran, not because their Arabic wasn't good, their Arabic was great, but like their dialect doesn't use that word. I'm talking about the likes of Umar ibn al-Khattab and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, right? Umar would be on the minbar, given a khutbah, and then he recites a verse and he said, wait, I actually don't know what does this word mean? Recited the ayah in Surah An-Nahl, he said, I don't know what this word means. And he asked people, does somebody know what this verse meant? A person from a different tribe than what Umar's tribe, he said, yes, we use this word in our tribe, and we use it to describe camels in a particular manner, and he gave him the citation for the cultural citation for that. And then Umar said, that's why we need poetry. That's why we need the literary tradition of the Arabs to be able to relate to the Quran. And that was intended by the Quran. It was designed in a way to address a lot of different people from different backgrounds. Yes, it's a book in Arabic, but it talks to many different cultures within the widest spectrum of the Arabic language. So the Prophet ﷺ started realizing that it's getting more difficult for some people to recite the Quran in a very, very precise manner. So he asked Jibreel ﷺ that I have old people in my community, I have young children in my community, and I have people in my community who are not very kind of experienced when it comes to literacy, and the recitation is difficult for them. So Jibreel responded to him and he said, Allah is commanding you to teach your community the Quran in 7 different modes. The hadith about sab'at ahruf. There are 7 different modes. And the general meaning is the Quran accommodates different dialectical styles of reciting the Quran. So you see today when you get a qari in the masjid or Ramadan and Taraweeh and they recite in different qira'at, you hear the word qira'at, right? You hear the word, he's reciting hafs, he's reciting qalun, he's reciting warsh. These are qira'at that reflect that dialectical diversity that the Prophet ﷺ granted Muslims divine permission to read the Quran this way. Because if you're familiar with qira'at, some people would recite wad-duha and some people would recite wad-duha, right? This very small intonation. It's not going to affect the meaning. It's just the way you articulate it. So the Prophet ﷺ, the meaning of the hadith is that he told Jibreel, if I have a 70-year-old convert and all of their lives they say duha, and now I tell them, no, you have to say duha, they're not going to be able to. And I don't want people to have barriers when it comes to reading the Quran. It didn't say that literally, that's the meaning of the hadith, right? The idea of removing barriers to the Quran was a very key objective for the Prophet ﷺ. So Jibreel said, yes, Allah is not just giving this as a kind of an exception. No, He's commanding you, يَأْمُرُكَ أن تقرئ أمتك, to teach your ummah, your community, in 7 different modes. And then he started letting people recite the Quran in slightly different ways. Of course, it remained the same text, the same integral text, it didn't change. But these kind of variations you see now, there is mad, there is, for those of you who study tajweed or qira'at, you know like a lot of different styles when it comes to certain, primarily about pronunciation or about articulation of certain words. It's a blessing from Allah that continues to accommodate our different capacities for articulating and reciting the Quran until today. One last point I will conclude with is the scholars of all different fields, they approach the Quran through the lenses of their field, and they kept extracting gems from the Quran in a very beautiful manner, from the same text, from the same surah. You find people, we mentioned examples about rhetoric, or people who study grammar, or people who study law, or people who study theology and aqidah. They can derive the same thing from the same text, from the same surah. And sometimes in ways that will surprise you. Sometimes you read a surah or ayah, you know, like, okay, it's just, there's only one meaning. And you find scholars who study philosophy is like, no, there's actually an important, interesting point here that relates to my field. And they reflect on it. To give you one example, the Surah Al-Masad, the short chapter, and now subhanAllah, it's not intentional, but like we're going the same order. So we spoke about Nas, Al-Falaq, Al-Ikhlas, and then the following one is Al-Masad, Tabbat Yada Abi Lahabin wa Tab. The surah, famous surah, talks about the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, who used to assault him, and him and the uncle Abu Lahab and his wife. So the surah condemns him and mentions that he's going to be in the hellfire with his wife. And by the way, that was another sign for the truthfulness of the Prophet. Because if Abu Lahab wanted to prove him wrong, he could have said, okay, now I'm Muslim. And then what? The surah was revealed and he was alive, right? If he wanted to make the Prophet look bad, he would say, okay, now I'm Muslim. Am I going to be in the hellfire? He didn't do that. And that was a sign for people that the Quran predicts the future. And it ends up happening that he dies and he never becomes a Muslim. So you should really think, at least give it a shot, that this text is actually coming from God. So the surah speaks about Tabbat Yada Abi Lahabin wa Tab, used the same word that he accused, he insulted the Prophet ﷺ with when he told him Tabban lak, meaning that may you perish. So the Quran responded to him saying, may the hands of Abu Lahab perish, may you perish, not the Prophet ﷺ. ما أغنى عنه ماله وما كسب. What did his wealth and his children avail for him? سيصلى نارا ذات لهب. He will be in blazing hellfire, he and his wife, the carrier of the firewood, وامرأته حمالة الحطب, until the end of the surah. So now that's a surah about the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, the people who harm him. And then you find some scholars of law who will come and say, you know what, we can derive a legal ruling from this surah. Can you think of any legal ruling that you can take or derive from Surah Al-Masad? The story of Abu Lahab is in the hellfire. What does law have to do with this? The what? Blasphemy. Maybe, but that's very indirect. They found something more explicit than this. And very unrelated to the story, by the way. Like, it's not really part of the morale of the story. Instead, Allah says, تبت يدا أبي لهب وتب ما أغنى عنه ماله وما كسب سيصلى نارا ذات لهب. About the punishment, he will be in blazing hellfire. وامرأته, and his wife, the carrier of the firewood. So the Quran said, and his wife. That means the Quran validates marriages happening between non-Muslims. Right? Because the Quran didn't say, and his friend or girlfriend or whatever. Quran used wife and his wife. They both were non-Muslims, and any legal system, even non-Islamic, even a US legal system, you have like domestic marriages and you have foreign marriages, so you would recognize different systems of marriages, right? So for Islam, there are laws that will apply to Muslim marriages, there will be laws applicable to Muslim, non-Muslim marriages, and there will be laws applicable to non-Muslim marriages. So they say it looks like the Quran appreciates or recognizes the validity of marriages happening between non-Muslim. So that, imagine how huge a system of laws can be built on this. It's actually a huge part of the family law legal system, or family law system. When you just like take that kind of glimpse, it has nothing to do with the story, but it has everything to do with the Quran, because this is what or how the scholars approach the Quran. They said, this is how we should be reflected in the text. Every possible meaning we have to do our best to derive from the Quran. The last point, and I know I promised it will be the last point, but second last point, you see how like all of these scholars are driving all these points. Imam al-Razi, rahimahullah, great scholar of tafsir, he said, the last 3 chapters in the Quran that we briefly spoke about, they all begin with what word? Qul, right? Say, A'udhu bi Rabbil Nas, say, A'udhu bi Rabbil Falaq, say, Qul huwa Allahu Ahad, right? The 4th surah is Tabbat Yada Abi Lahab wa Tab, the one that condemns Abu Lahab, the Prophet's uncle. He said, in this surah, Allah didn't say Tabbat Yada Abi Lahab wa Tab. If you think of it as a pattern, you would possibly expect, it doesn't have to be, but you would possibly expect, okay, he's commanding him to say these things or announce these things. In this 4th chapter, he didn't say, قُلْ تَبَّتْ يَدَ أَبِي لَهَبٍ وَتَبٍ. And he said, one reason, Wallahu A'lam, is that he didn't want to hurt the Prophet's feelings. Because even after all of what Abu Lahab did, it's his uncle, his family. Not just his uncle, by the way, 2 sons of Abu Lahab married 2 daughters of the Prophet. They were in-laws too. He said, out of respect to the Prophet's feelings, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he didn't want to tell him, go and say to people, my uncle has been like, or may the hands of my uncle be pierced. He's going to say it eventually anyway, right? It's the Quran. He's going to convey it. He's going to say it to people, and people are going to recite it, and we are going to continue to recite it until today. But just this very, very small kind of indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. He's al-Habib sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He's the most beloved to Allah. Just, Wallahu a'lam, again, this is a reflection. Out of love for the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he didn't want to hurt his feelings further. He's already revealing to him the destiny of his uncle to be in the hellfire, and his wife as well. And of course, they harmed him a lot, but he didn't want to add an extra emotional burden on the Prophet ﷺ by commanding him directly and explicitly, say and announce this to people, even though the outcome will be the same. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send his blessings and greetings upon our Prophet ﷺ. We ask him to forgive our sins and shortcomings. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا. اللهم تقبل أعمالنا واجعلها خالصة لوجهك الكريم. And جزاكم الله خيرا for the kind invite and for listening to my reflections. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. قولوا قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.